Welcome back to the Engage podcast. Ryan Argenta here, your host. Today I'm here with Jason Herman. He's the chairman of Airport and Ground Environment Subcommittee of the Central Air Safety Committee. Jason, welcome to the show.
Hey, good morning, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
You bet. You know, they often say those with the longest titles have the most important jobs. And I would say that safety and your role is no exception to that.
Absolutely. But fortunately, in safety, we like to add acronyms. So we just call it AGE for short.
Yeah, that's helpful. I love working with you and Central Air Safety, and these titles and subcommittees is pretty comical, but it's a serious business and it's an important business. So yeah, AGE subcommittee. You're also the LAX Airport Safety Liaison, which has to be a busy job because if you've been in and out of LA, you know that there's a lot going on between construction and traffic. And so things must be pretty hectic there. And then you're also an ER captain out of LA. So you've got your hands full, I would imagine.
I definitely have a couple different hats in safety, but I really enjoy it. And I learn a lot. I learn a lot just by reading reports, as we'll talk about here shortly, but just getting involved and knowing all the players.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your time. And so today we're talking about ASAP, which we all as pilots are generally familiar with ASAP. Majority of us have likely filled one out. And if you haven't, you will in your career. So take me through the life cycle of an ASAP. We generally know how to fill one out. And so once we hit submit, where does it go? And for us, it may be a black hole, but for you, that's where really the life of the ASAP begins. So if you would take me through the life cycle there, maybe even tell us what is the ERC, the Event Review Committee?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So ASAP stands for the Aviation Safety Action Program, and it's a voluntary, confidential, non-punitive form of safety reporting here at Delta and across many different carriers in the industry. And so when a pilot logs in to submit their ASAP, typically they don't hear anything back for about a week or two, but there's quite a life cycle of an individual ASAP report. So as soon as the pilot hits submit on their ASAP through the reporting system available through DeltaNet, it goes to a team of about 5 different admin folks that instantly review the report for any timely information that needs to be disseminated for the purposes of risk mitigation. Perhaps a pilot's reporting a safety concern. And so we don't want to wait a week or two to action that safety concern. We want to take care of it right away if we can. They also look at the reports and they de-identify any information in that report, including names, dates, any identifying information that could trace back to the flight number, the crew members, anything that's identifying will be removed before it gets sent to the Event Review Committee.
That's great to know. Essentially de-identified and
Yeah, so it's important to point out that ASAP isn't anonymous, but it is confidential. So there's a very select few individuals that can actually see pilot names associated with an ASAP report simply for the purposes of administrative nature. However, once those reports are de-identified and sent to the Event Review Committee, the ERC, as we like to call ourselves, we never see any names or identifying information. So when we get the ASAP packet for the reports from the previous week, all we see are the event narratives themselves, the city pair, and the aircraft type. But we don't see any identifying information, not only the names, but also any identifying information in the narratives themselves, like dates or other crew member names.
Okay. Yeah, good to know. And so zooming out a little bit, give me just a handful of examples of reasons pilots would fill out an ASAP.
Sure. So it's also important to point out ASAPs are always voluntary. You are never required to file an ASAP. However, there are a number of situations in the FOM that require you to file an ASR, which is an air safety report. However, an ASAP can be filed in lieu of an ASR and is actually the default selection when you go in to file an ASAP report. So ASAPs are always voluntary. A crew member could go in and deselect ASAP and just file an ASR. But any mandatory ASR can be filed as an ASAP and satisfy that requirement. So there's a number of requirements in the FOM to file an ASR. Those are in Chapter 19 of the FOM. But in addition to that, we really want to share with the pilot group that ASAPs are not just for when something goes wrong. ASAPs are really a proactive tool to identify safety hazards and risk in the operation. And we learned so much through the over 25,000 reports a year that pilots file outside of required reports to help us make the system safer.
Yeah, and that's a good distinction, that it's not when, you take the wrong taxiway, or not necessarily when something happens, or, You miss a taxiway and you say, well, we better file on ASAP. And sometimes I hear, ASAP's, cover your rear kind of report or a get out of jail free card. And there's so much more to an ASAP beyond that, right? Like you're mentioning. And we did episode 69 with Central Air Safety, Casey Songster, and she touched on ASAP and talked about how pilot ASAPs, I think in Minneapolis, where they built a new parking garage and they had this massive electronic billboard on the side. And as pilots flew in at night, the billboard was like blinding them. And so they took ASAPs and they actually changed the lighting or dimmed it on this billboard because of pilot feedback. So no wrongdoing, but that was good information that got through an ASAP. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Absolutely. There's small things like flight plan remarks that are generated out of reported safety concerns, all the way up to procedure changes. We made some significant enhancements in the airway manual to address pilot reported concerns about uncontrolled airport operations. So if you happen to pop open the airway manual sometime in the near future, you'll see in chapter 2.2, we have guides, just like the route guides that the wide body folks are used to, or some of the narrow body folks going to the Caribbean. Instead of having a route guide to take you from here across the Pacific, we have a route guide essentially to get you in or out of an uncontrolled airport. And that was all generated by feedback from ASAP reports.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know. Jason, what is the difference between an ASAP and an ASR since you brought that up?
Sure. So an ASR is a required report that goes to the company, and it addresses required items in chapter 19.3 of the FOM. These are things like whenever you declare an emergency or have some sort of aircraft incident or occurrence. Those are all required reports. However, they don't provide any additional regulatory protection like an ASAP report does. And so when an ASAP report is filed and accepted, it provides the pilot with assurance that report will be handled internally within the event review committee and will satisfy any follow-up FAA investigation if one were to occur.
So, and you said earlier that you could file an ASAP in lieu of an ASR. Would there be a reason to file both at the same time for the same event?
So when you go into file an ASAP, it actually files it as both an ASAP and an ASR, so it satisfies both requirements. We always recommend filing an ASAP with one very narrow exception, and that narrow exception is addressed as well in the FOM in section 19.4. It's the last paragraph, all the way at the bottom, and that has to do with reporting medical certification or qualification issues. So based on how those reports are processed within the confines of the FAA advisory circular on ASAP programs, we always recommend any pilots that have medical certification or qualification issues to file an ASR. But barring that one very narrow exception, we always recommend filing an ASAP.
Okay. Yeah, that's great to know. So now we fill out the ASAP, we hit submit. Where does it go? Who reads it? What's the timeline behind the scenes? Walk me through that, because that's pretty interesting from the time you hit submit.
Sure. So after you hit submit, it goes to the admin team, which I mentioned de-identifies the report. But they're also looking for other information, like things that need to be investigated by Delta for the purposes of safety. We have our own internal air safety investigator team. There may be time-critical issues that need to be addressed by line operations or other entities. But then lastly, it's also about fact-finding and gathering additional information that may be needed for the ERC to get a better perspective of the event. So for example, the admin team may see a report about a WDR error, and that may prompt them to reach out to performance engineering before the next ERC meeting to get some additional information about the flight, like actual copy of the WDR or just performance engineering's perspective on the event.
Okay, so admin takes it, de-identifies, and then, yeah, it goes and kind of gets the background info. Jason, what happens, we're generally on the road. There's some time limits for when you can file an ASAP. And I know Casey mentioned, don't worry about the time requirement for an ASAP. Just get it in and get it done no matter what. But, I filled out an ASAP a while ago, and after I hit submit, the captain texted me and said, hey, don't forget to put in this detail. And I said, oh, man. So what if you forget some of the details of the event, or you wanted to add something? Is there a way to go back and add it in or get that information to the ERC?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So when it comes to timeliness considerations, many pilots that have been on the seniority list for a little bit may recall that there used to be some very rigid time limits for filing ASAP reports. those time limits have been eliminated by the FAA. So if you actually look at the latest copy of the advisory circular for ASAP, those time limits are no longer. However, the ERC still requests that pilots file in a timely fashion, and in some very narrow circumstances, the ERC could exclude a report if it's not filed timely. And think about maybe a report filed many months later after an event. But barring that, you can absolutely amend your ASAP. And the easiest way to do that right now is to submit a subsequent ASAP for the same flight segment, just as an addendum, and that'll come through and be reviewed by the ERC as well.
Okay, that's good to know. So just file another ASAP for the same flight sec. That makes sense. And I guess if you're reading FAA advisory circulars, you're on the longest flight ever, and the Wi-Fi must be down, right?
It actually is in Comply 365, but I wouldn't recommend it on a long haul segment unless you're going back to crew rest, because it's a bear to get through.
Yeah, I would imagine that it doesn't have the same appeal as a good thriller. But Jason, can you give us some tips? You see ASAPs day in and day out. What are some tips or best practices? What would you like us to include, or how do you want us to write in an ASAP that would be best for your committee and the outcome for pilots?
Sure. So one of the big myths in ASAP is that only one pilot on the crew has to file an ASAP, and that's certainly untrue. So we want individual, unique reports from each pilot on the crew that observed or experienced some sort of safety issue or occurrence or observation. So that's really the first step, is having independent reports from each pilot on the crew. So I'll just put that out there. But additionally, as much detail as you can without getting too verbose. I've seen ASAPs that were 4 words, which probably leaves the ERC with a lot of question marks and may result in follow-up action. But we've also seen ASAPs that were 6 pages and left me wondering what the ultimate conclusion of the event was. So we want to make sure that the reports include a thorough level of detail, but it doesn't need to be 6 pages. We really enjoy when pilots provide robust lessons learned, and we'll get into follow-up actions that the ERC can take a little later. But if a pilot fills out an ASAP report and has an honest, thoughtful narrative with really strong lessons learned, like I went back later and looked up and found this reference in the FOM or Vol 1 that addressed the issue that we had or that we forgot about, that will give the ERC much more confidence that this crew actually resolved their own skill or knowledge deficiency. But if the lessons learned do not include any information or very little information that doesn't have much to do with the event, it leaves the ERC to understand that this pilot may or may not have a thorough understanding of what happened and how to prevent it from happening in the future.
Okay, so this kind of reminds me of like your interview prep, right? Your interview question with Delta, and they say, tell me about a time you had this issue, and you tell them a story, right? And you give them the intro, you give them the story, and then you don't leave it there. You give them and what I learned from it was this, and then the interviewers can go, okay, this pilot knows what they're talking about. They learned a good lesson. They've become a better pilot and a better human because of it. And now we're going to hire you. So really same theory applies here of, hey, here's what we did. Here's what we learned. And here's maybe a change that would help us find the reference sooner or better or easier, or maybe here's a change that we'd recommend to help pilots in the future based on, FOM section 19.3. Things like that, right? Is that what you're getting after?
Absolutely. And we take suggestions and we definitely forward them and action them. And just to provide a little context, after the ASAP goes through the admin program, or the admin folks, they prepare all the previous week's ASAP reports, and they compile them into one big PDF file that gets sent to the event review committee. And just to provide some clarity on that, the event review committee is all Delta line pilots. So as an ERC, we are all reviewing these from the lens of a fellow Delta pilot. Now, in the ERC itself, we have one company rep, one ALPA rep, and also a representative from the FAA. But we're all working together for the same common goal, which is to make Delta a safer airline. So once those reports get aggregated and distributed to the event review committee, keeping in mind there's only about 12 of us on each side, on the company side and the ALPA side, it only gets sent to the representatives that are working the meeting for that upcoming week. So all the previous week's ASAPs. And then there's such a high volume of reports, we divide it out between the Airbus fleets and the Boeing fleets. And each rep can work either meeting, although most reps generally prefer to work the meeting that corresponds to the fleet that they fly, just due to more familiarity with that aircraft and manufacturer. But once that packet is sent, it's typically sent out at the end of the previous week, and we have a few days to review it and put in requests for any additional information. Now, there are a lot of reports. There's a lot of activity happening on the line in any given week. And so just to give you an idea of what the reporting volume looks like, we're looking at probably between 300 and 400, sometimes pushing 450 events, not just reports, but events in a single week, depending on whether it's a slow period of time or maybe high time in the summer. So that corresponds to about 800 to 900 pages of reading every week for the ERC.
That's crazy. I didn't realize that volume was that high.
Yeah, it's a significant ask. Fortunately, we have some shorter reports, which sometimes it may be just a simple bird strike or a TCAS RA or something that doesn't require a ton of writing. You never know. I mean, bird strikes can cause other issues. TCAS RAs, we want to make sure crews are compliant, but it's a significant amount of reading. And we have a very short period of time to do it before we need to request additional information. Typically, we get the ERC packet on late Thursday or early Friday, and we have until the end of the day Tuesday to put in requests for any additional information we may want in preparation for the ERC meeting, which occurs every Thursday.
Okay. Who has more ASAPs, Boeing or Airbus?
That's hard to say. I think Boeing is in the lead right now, but I can say the 737-900, the 321, and the 75 are very large fleets. So there's a large volume of reporting on those particular fleets and subfleets, but it's always interesting because sometimes it ebbs and flows. Sometimes Airbus has more than Boeing.
Yeah. Well, we got to keep this fun, as we go along. You talked about some of the outcomes or follow-ups after the ERC gets an ASAP. What are those potential outcomes after a pilot hits submit?
So when we review the events, we are looking for reports and events that we want to follow up and talk about in the ERC meeting itself. There are many reports, in fact, the majority of reports, that don't require any follow-up discussion or action, in which case we don't talk about those events in the ERC because each ERC has read those reports thoroughly and has decided that there's really nothing that warrants any follow-up, and so we accept those reports. And as soon as the ERC meeting is finished, the pilot gets an email that just says that the report's been closed. But there are some events that leave the ERC with more questions than answers. And so that's typically where we have some thoughtful discussion in the meeting itself with the other 2 reps, so 3 reps total, between the company rep, the ALPA rep, and the FAA rep, and figure out, does this pilot or crew have some sort of deficiency with skill or proficiency or knowledge? Do we have assurance based on this pilot's report that they really understood what happened? And so if we have those questions and we feel that it warrants a follow-up, the ERC can prescribe a number of different activities that occur after the ERC meeting. Some of them can be voluntary, some of them can be mandatory. And so those can include things like a simple follow-up phone call from a human factors trained debriefer. And I'll mention all of our debriefers are awesome, and they're all Delta Line pilots. So as you can see a theme here, it's all Delta Line pilots helping support this program. So it could be something as simple as a phone call. It may be a video call on Microsoft Teams or Zoom. It could be an in-person debrief where the crew or the pilot comes to Atlanta, or maybe even another location that's convenient for the pilots and the debriefer. So we've had in-person debriefs that have occurred outside of Atlanta because the pilots were West Coast based. It could result in a simulator session, which is not any one particular curriculum. It's items that the ERC specifically wants to have the pilot practice or demonstrate. And then ultimately, we can even have instructional or supervised flying with a line check pilot. And keep in mind, all of these different avenues for follow-up with the pilot are all held confidentially within the ASAP program.
Okay. Yeah, that's a pretty wide range of debrief. I didn't actually realize that was the case when I asked that question. So I guess backing up just a hair. So if you get a voicemail or you get a call from a member of the ERC, really 2 potential reasons for the call. One could just be for further information. Maybe you didn't write enough, or maybe you wrote something that needed clarification in the ASAP, or more information that would help, rewrite a publication or something, right? So that's one option, could just be more information. And then a second option is, I guess, some debrief or some instruction. And this is all non-punitive, right? This is, you said both voluntary. Sometimes it's mandatory. Hey, you're going to come in and have a simulator session, but really non-punitive in nature, right?
That's exactly right. So the record of the training is all kept within the ASAP program. It's not put in anyone's personnel file. It's not in your training record. There's really no one outside of the very small ASAP administrative team that knows that this debrief even occurs. Even in the simulator, if the ERC prescribes a simulator, keep in mind the simulator may not even be mandatory. Sometimes the ERC prescribes a voluntary simulator. If it's something in the pilot's report that the pilot says, hey, it'd be really nice if we got some more training, or I could get some more training on, crosswind landings at the max crosswind limit. We may offer a voluntary simulator session for you to get that practice or proficiency. But in some cases, the ERC may prescribe one of the items in a mandatory fashion. And it's really just to learn more about the event and figure out exactly what happened and why it happened, and see if we can answer any questions and increase the level of confidence and proficiency in the pilot so that they feel good moving forward when they're back flying the line.
Yeah, because often pilots are like, man, they don't cover this in CQ, or they don't cover this in initial qual, and something comes up. So that's actually good to know that as a backstop, it's like, hey, why don't you come in if you want voluntarily? If you want to come to Atlanta, jump in the sim. We'll run you through that, max crosswind scenario and give you a little more training if you want. And I know every pilot just perked up and said, well, do you get paid? If you're brought in, whether voluntary or mandatory, you go to a sim or a debrief, is that pay protected? What happens there?
So any sort of voluntary prescription that the ERC offers is not paid, but anything beyond a phone call, so a video debrief, an in-person debrief, simulator, or supervised flying would all be paid and pay protected. Phone calls are generally pretty short in nature, maybe 30 to 45 minutes on average. So those are not paid, but it's actually more beneficial to the pilot than they would think, because it's an opportunity to potentially vent to another Delta line pilot to talk about what happened, but also learn a little bit more and get some feedback from the ERC on their perspective.
Yeah, very good. Switching to the other side of that, you talked about often we submit an ASAP, you don't hear anything for a little bit, and then you get the email that says the ERC has reviewed your ASAP and it's been closed out. Is there anything I should be looking for in that email, or anything I need to be looking for if I don't get that closeout in a particular period of time?
Sure. So the closeout is by and far what most pilots are used to receiving, usually the week after. So keep in mind, all of our ERC meetings are on Thursdays. So if you happen to file an ASAP Wednesday, it may or may not make the following week's ERC. So there's a little bit of latency there. But one of the additional tools that we have, I didn't mention as a formal prescription, is we have the opportunity to provide the pilot some written comments. And so those written comments are often overlooked because they're included in that automated closeout email. And we have some options to put some pre-canned responses of items that the ERC frequently sees. For example, let's say that you land without a landing clearance. It provides a response that talks about some potential techniques to mitigate that in the future. We also have the opportunity to write our own custom response. So an ERC member will sit down and actually write a few sentences out and say, the ERC received your report. We really appreciate you taking the time to file. At your next earliest convenience, please review FOM chapter XYZ that reviews this area. It was not clear from your report that, this section of the FOM was reviewed. You may want to take a look at it before your next flight. And so that's something to be mindful of and to look at. It should be included now at the top of all of those closeout emails. So I realize many pilots may not be specifically looking for anything other than the automated closeout message, but that's something to be mindful of and look at the top. With regard to when the pilot would receive that closeout, it's not uncommon for a report to be held open for an additional week, very rarely beyond another additional week, but we may need some more information. One of the things I didn't mention earlier is that during the pre-ERC process, we call it the triage process, where the ASAP admin team can send these reports to other departments within Delta for feedback or information. We may be waiting for information from crew scheduling or performance engineering, or we integrate with other ASAP programs at Delta. For example, we work really well with the dispatch ASAP program. So we may be reaching out and asking if there's an ASAP report from dispatch or load control. And so those are all things that we may still be waiting for. We may also be looking at the FOQA data. Maybe the FOQA data hasn't downloaded yet. And so we're waiting another week to take a look at the FOQA data to see how that can help us get a better idea of what happened in addition to the pilot's ASAP. So Don't fret if you don't get the automated email within a week or two, but you're always welcome to call the Flight Safety Admin Team or the ALPA Central Air Safety Committee. I'm happy to talk through that process.
Yeah, that was a great overview there. And I didn't realize all those tools. So yeah, look at those emails a little closer than, yeah, okay, it was closed out because there may be some nuggets in there for you. You mentioned FOQA and how does FOQA work with ASAP? How do those two things intertwine and how are they different? And then I guess a follow-up question, when you look at the flight pulse data for a particular airport and it has, information and data like unstable approaches, and you're like, man, there's a high number of unstable approaches to this runway. Is that all part of your program? Is there a connection there?
So traditionally, FOQA and ASAP programs have lived in separate spaces. However, at Delta, we're very fortunate that we have a very robust ASAP and FOQA program, and they are now very much integrated in the sense that the FOQA folks can look at and see that a pilot or crew has filed an ASAP report and they have the information. And similarly, on the ASAP side, we can request additional FOQA data to help us gain a better perspective of what may have happened on a particular flight. I would say the most enlightening probably comes from unstable approaches, but also mode confusion, FMA, MCP confusion of mode selection. And so FOQA can give us a really wide angle view of what may have happened in a specific event that we're looking at in the ERC, and can also be included in some of those ERC prescriptions. I didn't mention earlier, one other ERC prescription is a FOQA share. So we can actually have a gatekeeper reach out to the crew and go through the FOQA data. I would say that's not used as often anymore because of Flight Pulse. So crews have a very handy tool to look at their own FOQA data. However, we can leverage that in other debriefs, like a video or in-person debrief, and FOQA can come in and show an animation of what the flight looked like or what the automation modes were. So when pilots get contacted by the company for some sort of debrief, they may be a bit apprehensive. They may wonder, do I need to contact my rep? Do I need to call my chief pilot? Does this reflect poorly on me? Is this going to go on my record? And the answer is it's an opportunity to learn. It's really an extension of our training efforts, and it's an opportunity to learn and reflect. And so, no, you don't need your rep. No, you don't need your chief pilot. We're happy to be advocates. We're happy to explain the process to you. But keep in mind, it's all Delta line pilots providing feedback and perspective to fellow Delta line pilots. And so it's just important to remember that the ASAP program protects you. So if there were ever a FAA pilot deviation, that's handled exclusively through ASAP as long as one is filed. If an ASAP is not filed, then the FAA is welcome to conduct their own independent investigation outside of ASAP. But as long as an ASAP is filed, everything is handled within the ASAP program. And I can say, as an ERC rep who's worked in this space for going on almost 5 years now, it's super confidential. I have friends of mine that reach out and say, hey, did you see my ASAP from last week? And unless they tell me what the event is, I can't tell you because I don't see the names. So you can tell me what it was, but I may or may not have seen it, but I don't know the names. I see city pairs and aircraft types, and that's really all the reports come back to the ERC as. So, my message to the pilot group would be to please file, not just for when things go wrong, but also for when things go right so we can learn more. Provide suggestions. Don't just limit it to PCRs and FCRs. File an ASAP. If it's safety related, we're happy to take a look at it. Send it to the fleet. They can take a look at making changes to publications. We have many other groups that look at ASAPs after they've been filed to see if there's trends. I work on another group called the Threat Review Team, the TRT. We look at ASAPs after they've been closed out, and we action issues that may need to be resolved. So a lot of the 10.7Z threat spotlight pages that you may find in FD Pro in certain airports, those are all based on pilot ASAP.
Wow. Always impressed talking to the safety team and Central Air Safety and everybody on your team as well. And you all know your stuff so well, and you're so professional and so dialed into helping pilots. And I just love that. And this is one aspect I love about the podcast is meeting, pilot volunteers, essentially pilot volunteers through these ALPA committees that know these subject areas and give their time and give their expertise. And safety always comes in strong. Everybody does. It's impressive what we as pilots have kind of working behind the scenes and working on our behalf, both in Central Air Safety and in all the committees of the MEC. So Jason, thanks for giving us that great overview, and thanks for supporting us and encouraging us and making those changes to make things not just safer, but better and easier. And so that was a really great message, and I appreciate your time.
Our pleasure. Just know that ASAPs are not a black hole. We do read each and every ASAP. And don't be a stranger. Even after you file the ASAP, if you want more feedback or you want more information, please reach out. Whether it's the ASAP admin team on the company side or it's the Central Air Safety Committee, you can get in touch with us via DART on the APA website. We're happy to be a resource and provide perspective on whether it's the ASAP process or just anything safety related.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks, Jason. And, before we go, give me something fun. When you're not flying, when you're not doing safety stuff, reading ASAPs and threat reports, what do you like to do? Do you live in LA?
I live in Orange County and I'm an aviation nerd, so I like to fly little airplanes as well. So I'm usually flying low and slow over the coast of Orange County at 1,000 feet with no reroutes and no calls from crew scheduling telling me where to go or when to go. So aviation nerd through and through, but I'm usually out flying a small airplane for fun.
Awesome. Love it. Well, when I'm out at the beach in OC and I see that plane, I'll know it's you.
You're right.
So,
I'll wave.
Jason Herman, the chairman of the AGE, the Airport and Ground Environment Subcommittee, the Central Air Safety Committee, long title, great work. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Take care.
You're listening to Engage, the podcast for Delta pilots. Follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform, and receive notifications when a new episode is available.